You've lived alone long enough, Mom. It's time we took care of things around here. My son-in-law said it the way men say things when they've already decided the answer and are only informing you of the verdict. Not asking, never asking, just telling. The way you'd tell a child it's bedtime. Firm and final. No room for negotiation. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, my hands still wet from washing the breakfast dishes, watching the morning light come through the window I had hung lace curtains on 31 years ago. The words landed softly, almost reasonably, and yet something inside me shifted the way old floorboards shift just before they crack. My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old. I was a school librarian for 34 years. I raised my daughter Sandra alone after her father left when she was 9. I paid off this house with my own paychecks, my own careful budgeting, my own years of quiet sacrifice. I refinished these floors myself. I planted the garden out back myself. I chose every piece of furniture in every room based on nothing more than what made me feel at home in my own life. And I had just been told in my own kitchen that it was time someone else took care of things. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands slowly on the dish towel, looked at my son-in-law Derek standing in the doorway with his coffee mug and his certainty. "Thank you," I said. That was all. But something had woken up inside me. Something old and patient, and done with being quiet. Sandra and Derek had moved in 14 months earlier. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. Nothing like this ever is. Derek had accepted a job transfer that fell through at the last minute, and they were left with a broken lease, 2 young children, and a plan that had dissolved before it ever began. My daughter called me on a Wednesday evening, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since she was a little girl. "Mom," she said, "we don't know what to do. Come stay with me." I told her, "Of course, stay as long as you need, because that's what you say. Because she is my daughter and her children are my grandchildren, and this house has 4 bedrooms and I have more space than one woman needs. Because love doesn't calculate in advance the cost of its own generosity." They arrived on a Saturday with 2 minivans and a trailer. My grandchildren, Lily and Owen, ran into the yard the way children run when they don't yet understand the difference between visiting and taking over. I held them both and breathed in the smell of their hair and told myself everything would be fine. For the first few months, it was. Sandra helped with grocery runs. Derek fixed the dripping faucet in the upstairs bathroom that I had been meaning to call a plumber about for 2 years. We ate dinner together on weeknights. There was noise in the house again, and for a widow who had gotten used to silence, noise felt like warmth. But warmth, I have learned, is not the same as respect. And family, I have learned at some cost, is not the same as gratitude. The first thing I noticed was the way Derek began talking about the house as though it were a shared enterprise. Not my house, not Sandra's childhood home, just the house. Neutral, ownerless, up for discussion. He'd stand in the kitchen with his arms crossed and say things like, "The layout in here really doesn't work," or "We should think about knocking out that wall between the dining room and the living room." Not suggestions, observations. The kind a person makes when they've already positioned themselves as having a say. Sandra never corrected him. I noticed that too. By the 4th month, they had moved my sewing table out of the small room at the end of the hall without asking me. They said the kids needed more space for their things, and the small room made more sense as a toy room. I didn't argue. It was a small thing. I told myself it was a small thing. By the 7th month, Derek had commandeered the garage for his woodworking equipment. He set up a workbench where I used to keep my gardening supplies. My rakes, my trowels, my bags of mulch were relocated to the narrow strip along the side of the house where they sat exposed to weather. He mentioned once, in passing, that he'd get me a storage bin for the yard. He never did. By the 10th month, they had repainted the living room without asking. I came home from book club one Tuesday evening to find the walls a shade of gray I had never chosen, the warm cream I'd lived with for 15 years covered over in 48 hours while I was out. Sandra showed me a paint swatch and told me it was more modern, and the old color was a little yellow. Mom, really? I stood in the doorway of my own living room and smiled and said it looked nice. But somewhere behind that smile, a woman I had been setting aside for years was getting quietly to her feet. The morning Derek told me it was time he took care of things. I had just returned from my Tuesday shift at the hospital gift shop, where I volunteered twice a week. I liked it there. I liked being useful in a way that was chosen, not assumed. I liked walking home through the neighborhood and stopping to check on Mrs. Beaumont next door, who was 84 and needed company more than she needed anything else. That particular Tuesday, I came home to find Derek in my kitchen using my good Dutch oven to make a recipe he'd seen online. The counter was covered in flour. There were 3 pots soaking in the sink. The mail I'd stacked neatly on the hall table had been moved without reason. I changed my shoes and began quietly cleaning up around him, and that's when he said it. "You've lived alone long enough, Mom. It's time we took care of things around here." He didn't even look up from what he was stirring. I said thank you. I dried my hands. I went to sit on the back porch for a while. The yard was beginning to show signs of neglect. The rose bushes along the fence hadn't been cut back the way I usually did every October. The garden beds I'd planted with perennials 15 years ago were choked with crabgrass. I had been meaning to get to them, but somehow there was never a quiet morning anymore, never a weekend morning that wasn't occupied by the children's activities or Derek's projects or Sandra's errands that always seemed to require my car. I sat in the old wicker chair I'd had since before Sandra was born and looked at my garden and thought about a word I had been avoiding for a long time: permanent. They had stopped talking about their next move. There were no more conversations about rental listings or saved apartments on real estate apps. Lily had started at the elementary school 3 blocks away. Owen had joined a soccer league that practiced at the park down the street. Derek was working remotely from the bedroom I used to use as a reading room, and Sandra had signed up for a community yoga class on Thursday mornings. They had put down roots in my life without asking whether I had any room left to grow. I went back inside and looked at the house through different eyes. Not the eyes of a grandmother happy to have her family nearby, but the eyes of a woman examining her own home for signs of what it had become. And what I saw unsettled me. There were photographs on the mantel I didn't recognize. Family portraits from a beach trip they had taken 2 summers ago before they moved in. My photographs, the ones I had kept there for years. My late mother's portrait, the one of Sandra and me on her graduation day, the one of this house taken the week I got the keys, were stacked in a box in the hall closet. I found them by accident looking for an umbrella. They were face down. Face down. My own photographs. In my own house. I closed the closet door carefully. I did not say anything that evening. But something in me had stopped making excuses. The week I found the photographs was also the week I first overheard them talking about the house in a way that made my hands go cold. I had come downstairs at 11 in the evening for a glass of water. I do that sometimes, old habits of age. The light under the living room door told me they were still up. I wasn't trying to listen, but the walls in a house you've lived in for 30 years carry voices the way they carry memories, whether you ask them to or not. Derek's voice was low but clear. With interest rates where they are, if we could get our names on the deed, even as co-owners, we'd qualify for the refinance easily. Sandra murmured something I couldn't make out. Derek continued, "It makes sense financially. She's not going to live forever, and this way we'd be protected. We'd be set. She's not going to live forever." I stood in the dark hallway holding my empty glass. I was 67 years old, in good health, sharp as I had ever been. I walked 2 miles every morning. I had just finished reading my 7th book of the year. I had plans, modest ones, but mine. A trip to see my college roommate in Vermont. A quilt I had been designing in my head for 2 years. More mornings in the garden, and I had just heard my son-in-law measure my remaining years against a refinancing opportunity. I went back to bed without the water. I lay there in the dark looking at the ceiling, listening to the refrigerator hum the way it always had, the particular low note it settled into after midnight. I had bought that refrigerator 17 years ago. I remembered the delivery men arguing over the doors. Sleep did not come. Instead, something else came. The same quiet certainty I used to feel on the last day of school every year, when 30 years of accumulated patience would finally lift off my shoulders and I could breathe all the way down again. The feeling of having made a decision so completely that the deciding was already done. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name was Robert Kellner. He had handled my estate documents when my husband left, and again when my mother passed 4 years ago. He had a small office above the dry cleaner on Maple Street, and he always offered terrible coffee that I always accepted out of politeness. I told him everything, not with anger, not with tears. The same way I used to conference with parents about a child who needed more support, clearly and without drama. Here is what is happening. Here is what I need. Robert listened without interrupting, which I had always appreciated about him. When I finished, he said, "Your instincts are sound, Margaret. Let me pull your deed and your current estate documents, and I'll call you Thursday." I thanked him and drove home and made lunch and watered the plants on the back porch that no one else remembered to water. That week, I watched Sandra and Derek more carefully than I had allowed myself to before. What I saw confirmed what I had been choosing not to see. Sandra deferred to Derek on almost everything inside this house. Where to put things, when to cook what, whose schedule the weekend would center on. She had grown up in this house learning to be independent, learning that a woman could manage her own life without waiting for someone else's permission. I had shown her that deliberately, and somewhere between then and now, that woman had been smoothed down and rearranged by a man who was very good at making his preferences sound like common sense. I grieved that quietly. The way you grieve things you cannot fix, only witness. On Thursday morning, Robert called as promised. The news was straightforward. The house was mine. Free and clear, sole ownership, no liens, no complications. My will left the property to Sandra outright, with a standard clause about the grandchildren. Nothing in the current documents would stop Derek from attempting to pressure a deed change, though legally he could do nothing without my signature, which I would never give. But Robert suggested something else, something I had not considered. A revocable living trust, with the house placed inside it, with explicit language that no changes to ownership or beneficiary could be made without the approval of a named independent trustee, a trusted person outside the family. My friend Carol, who had been a paralegal for 20 years before she retired, agreed without hesitation when I asked. By Friday afternoon, the paperwork was in motion. I did not tell Sandra or Derek, not yet. I needed a few more days, not to gather courage, but to gather clarity. To be sure I was acting from truth and not from anger. Because anger makes you fast. Truth makes you sure. The moment that made me certain came on a Sunday. Derek had invited his brother over, a man named Phil who I had met twice and neither time with any particular warmth. They sat in my living room, the one with the new gray walls, watching a football game with the volume high enough to rattle the small ceramic figures on the shelf beside the television. I came in to retrieve my book, which I had left on the side table. Phil looked up and said, with his eyes still mostly on the screen, "Derek tells me you're thinking about downsizing eventually, that this might be on the market in a few years." I stood very still. I looked at Derek. He had the careful expression of a man who has been caught slightly before he expected to be, but who has already prepared an explanation. "Oh, we were just talking generally," he said, easily. "Nothing definite." Nothing definite. I picked up my book. I smiled pleasantly. I said it was nice to see Phil again. Then I walked down the hall to my room, sat on the edge of my bed, and understood with perfect clarity that Derek had been discussing selling my house with his brother as though it were something that would eventually belong to him to sell. I called Robert that evening and told him to accelerate the trust paperwork. And I asked him about one additional document. He said he could have it ready by Wednesday. Wednesday morning came in gray and cold, the kind of November morning that smells like old leaves and wood smoke. I had made a pot of oatmeal and a full breakfast, enough for everyone, the way I used to do when Sandra was growing up. I set the table. I poured the juice. When they came downstairs, I was sitting in my usual chair with my tea, unhurried. Sandra commented that I was up early. I told her I had things to take care of. Derek poured his coffee and checked his phone and said nothing. At 9:15, the doorbell rang. Sandra looked up. Derek's eyes flicked toward the hall. I stood and walked to the door at my own pace. Robert stood on the porch in his coat, briefcase in hand, his expression professional and patient in the way that only attorneys and ER nurses ever really master. "Margaret," he said. "Good morning. I have the documents you asked for." I stepped aside to let him in. Behind me, I heard Derek set his coffee mug down. "Who's that?" Sandra asked. "My attorney," I said. "We have some paperwork to finalize this morning." "Paperwork," Derek repeated carefully. "What kind of paperwork?" I turned to face them. Both of them. My daughter, who had my eyes, and her father's habit of going quiet when she was afraid, and her husband, who had calculated the timeline of my life against a mortgage interest rate. "I've placed the house in a living trust," I said. "The terms are straightforward. The property remains mine for as long as I live. Upon my passing, it transfers to Sandra, with conditions outlined in the trust that protect it from being sold or refinanced without the approval of an independent trustee for a period of 10 years. Sandra blinked. Derek went very still. "Additionally," I continued, keeping my voice even, "I've asked Robert to prepare a formal notice, not to be unkind, but because I believe clarity is kinder than silence." I handed Derek the envelope. He opened it slowly. His face changed as he read, the careful confidence draining out of it the way color drains from a face in a cold wind. "What is this?" "It's a request," I said, "that you begin making arrangements for your own housing. I'm giving you 90 days, which is more than generous. I will help with references, with moving logistics, with whatever I can reasonably do. But this house is mine, and I have decided it will remain mine in the ways that matter." 90 days, Derek said quietly. His voice had a quality I had not heard in it before. Something reduced. "Mom," Sandra began. Her voice was different, stripped of its usual careful neutrality. It feels very sudden." I looked at my daughter. Really looked at her, the way I used to look at her when she was 9 years old and needed me to tell her something true, even when it hurt. "It isn't sudden, sweetheart," I said gently. "It's just the first time I've said it out loud." Derek put the letter on the table. He did not look at me for a long moment. When he did, there was no more maneuvering in his face. Just a man who had miscalculated something significant. "We didn't mean to make you feel like this," he said. "I know," I answered. "But meaning nothing doesn't change what happened." Robert stood quietly by the door, with the patience of a man who has seen this particular silence before and knows it must simply be allowed to exist. After he left, the house was quieter than it had been in over a year. Not the hostile quiet of resentment, but the wide-open quiet of something finally having been said. Sandra found me on the back porch that afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a moment, before coming out, the way she used to stand in my bedroom doorway as a child when she needed to tell me something she hadn't rehearsed. She sat down in the other wicker chair. We looked at the garden together, the crabgrass, the unpruned roses. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Not for Derek. Not explaining him or defending him. Just the two words, clean and direct, the way I had always tried to teach her to apologize. "I know you are," I said. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. Was it the photographs? The ones in the closet? That was one thing, I said. She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means I already knew. She had known, and let it happen anyway. We both sat with that truth for a moment. I love him, Mom, she said quietly. I know he's not always easy. You don't have to defend him to me, I said. You have to make decisions about your own life. That's different. She looked at me with something in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Not the daughter deferring to the mother. Not the adult child managing the aging parent. Just Sandra. Just my girl. Confused and trying to find her footing. I reached over and put my hand on hers for a moment. Then I took it back. You will find a home, I said. A good one. One that's yours from the beginning. That matters more than you know right now. She nodded again, slower. She didn't argue about the 90 days. What followed was 6 weeks of quiet industry. Moving boxes appeared in the upstairs hall. Closets were excavated. The kitchen gradually shed its doubled inventory of pots and appliances, and I could see the original shape of the cabinets again. My gardening tools reappeared from the side of the house, and I moved them back into the garage myself, one armful at a time. Derek was careful around me in those weeks, polite in the precise, surface way of someone who has learned the limits of a situation. He did not make eye contact easily. He did not offer opinions about the house. He did not call me Mom anymore, which I found, to my surprise, something of a relief. One evening, he knocked on my door. Actually knocked, knuckles against the wood, waited. Come in, I said. He stood in the doorway looking like a man who had prepared something to say and wasn't sure it would land the way he'd intended. He was holding a small wooden box, the kind you buy at a craft store. Inside were items I recognized. A pearl button from a cardigan I'd loved. A small silver bookmark my mother had given me. A ceramic robin that had lived on the windowsill of the reading room before it became his office. Sandra found these in our things, he said. I'm sorry they got mixed up. I took the box. I held it for a moment. Without speaking, Derek shifted his weight. I want you to know, he started, then stopped. He tried again. I got comfortable here in a way that wasn't mine to be comfortable. I understood that, too late. I looked at him steadily. Understanding late is still understanding, I said. He nodded. That was all. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. But it was enough to acknowledge that something real had been named between us. That the distance between where we were and where we should have been had finally been measured honestly. They found a rental 4 weeks later, a 3-bedroom on the east side of town, near the school so the children wouldn't have to transfer. Sandra sent me the listing on a Tuesday with a message that said simply, "We put down the deposit." I wrote back, "I'm glad." The morning they finished moving out was a Saturday in early December. The children were bundled in their winter coats, carrying the last of their small things, backpacks and stuffed animals, the particular cargo of children who are trying to be helpful without fully understanding what is happening. Lily stopped in front of me in the hallway. She was 7. Solemn in the way that 7-year-olds are when they sense that the adults around them are feeling something large. "We're going to our new house," she said. "You are," I told her. "And it's going to be a good one. Will you visit?" I crouched down to her level, my knees complaining quietly, and looked at her. "Of course I will," I said. "You just call me." She hugged me with the unself-conscious fierceness of children, all arms and no reservation. I held on for a breath longer than necessary. Owen was next. He said, "Grandma, can we still have Saturday breakfasts?" "Every Saturday you want," I told him. Sandra stood at the door, holding 2 bags, and not quite looking at me directly, the way she had looked away from hard things her whole life. I went to her, and I was the one who opened my arms first. The way I had always been the one, because that was my role, and I had always accepted it gladly. She leaned into me, and for a moment, She was 9 years old again, and I was the one person between her and everything uncertain. "I love you, Mom," she said. "I love you too," I said. "Now go build something that's yours." When they pulled out of the driveway, I stood on the front porch until the car turned the corner and disappeared. The street was quiet. A neighbor's wind chime turned slowly in the cold air. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and stopped. I went back inside. The house was empty in the way houses are after people leave, a presence defined by absence, rooms that still hold the shape of the life that had been lived in them. I walked through slowly, not out of sadness, but out of something that felt like reintroduction. "Hello again," I thought, touching the doorframe of the reading room. "Hello again." I spent the rest of that morning putting things back. My books returned to the shelves in the reading room. The photographs came out of the closet box, out of the darkness, and went back on the mantel where they had always belonged. My mother's face, Sandra, at 18. This house, in the summer of the year I first unlocked its door, young and terrified and entirely my own, I hung them carefully, leveling each one by eye, the way I had always done. By noon, the light was coming in clean through the front windows, the kind of winter light that is thin but honest. I made a pot of soup and ate a bowl of it at the kitchen table with a book, and no one else's schedule pressing against mine. That afternoon, I put on my coat and went out to the garden. The crabgrass was still there. The roses still needed cutting. The perennial beds were a mess of dead growth that would need clearing before anything new could come through. I picked up the trowel and I started. The ground was cold but workable. My hands remembered what to do, the way hands remember things that have been done for years, without thought, without instruction. I worked for 2 hours until my back told me it was time to stop. I stood up slowly, pressed my hands against my lower back, looked at the small patch I had reclaimed from the weeds. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. That's what I thought about on the porch that evening, as the light went out of the sky and the temperature dropped, and I sat in the old wicker chair with a blanket across my lap and a cup of chamomile tea that was entirely for me. I thought about beginnings. I was 67 years old. I had spent 34 years teaching children to love books, and 31 years in this house, and a lifetime learning that patience is not the same as permission, that love is not the same as surrender, that a woman who has built something with her own hands retains the right to decide what happens to it, not because of paperwork, though the paperwork matters, but because of the simple, quiet, unargued fact of having built it. I thought about Sandra, and I hoped she would find what I had found here. Not the house, not the garden, but the particular piece of a life that is shaped by your own choices. I hoped Derek would learn, slowly or quickly, that the spaces in other people's lives are not empty lots waiting for development. I hoped my grandchildren would remember Saturday breakfasts and a grandmother who showed them that old women do not simply make room. Sometimes we draw lines, and I thought about every woman who had ever been made to feel like a guest in her own story. If there is one thing 34 years of working with children taught me, it is that the most important stories are not the ones with the loudest voices. They are the ones that speak quietly and stay with you long after the room has gone silent. This is one of those stories. It belongs to anyone who has ever needed to hear it. You built your life. You are allowed to live in it. And if someone tries to take that from you, even gently, even with the language of love and family and practicality, you are allowed to say no, clearly, legally, and without apology. That is not selfishness. That is the oldest wisdom there is. I finished my tea. I watched the stars come out over the oak tree in the backyard, the one I planted the year Sandra started kindergarten, which is now taller than the house. The wind moved through its branches. The house settled around me the way it always had, the particular voice of its timbers, the refrigerator, the pipes, the windows in a west wind, all of it mine, all of it home. I closed my eyes and breathed all the way down.